At first, waiting felt temporary, something that would end once instructions arrived or decisions were made. But as hours became days and days lost their shape, waiting stopped being a pause and began to act like a condition, quietly altering how time was perceived, how effort was measured, and how meaning was assigned to each passing moment, until the question was no longer what they were waiting for, but what waiting itself was slowly turning them into. In the beginning, waiting was understood as something with edges, a state that existed between two clear moments, one where orders had last been given and another where new instructions were expected to arrive. The prisoners measured their days by this assumption, believing that waiting was temporary by nature, and that time, if endured patiently, would eventually reveal its purpose. This belief allowed them to organize their thoughts around anticipation rather than uncertainty. The camp itself reinforced this idea through structure. There were schedules, movements, and repeated tasks that suggested continuity with the outside world, even if that world was no longer visible. Meals arrived, roll calls happened, and lights changed with predictable regularity, giving the impression that waiting was simply a delay inside a functioning system. As long as the system appeared to move forward, the men assumed they were moving with it, even if slowly. During this phase, waiting did not yet feel passive. It was filled with mental activity, speculation, and quiet planning. Men imagined possible outcomes, replayed past decisions, and constructed internal timelines that explained how long this state might last. These thoughts were not always optimistic, but they were active, and activity gave waiting a sense of direction. Time felt heavy, but it still felt meaningful. Conversations, when they occurred, often circled around imagined futures rather than present conditions. Someone might mention a possible transfer, another might recall a rumor heard weeks earlier, and these fragments were enough to sustain the idea that waiting was part of a larger process. Even silence, at this stage, carried expectation, because silence was interpreted as the space before something changed. The body responded accordingly. Men maintained habits that assumed eventual movement, conserving energy not out of resignation, but preparation. Posture, routine, and attention remained aligned with the belief that waiting required readiness, not surrender. The mind stayed alert, scanning for signs that the pause was nearing its end. Importantly, identity remained intact during this period. Waiting did not yet redefine who they were, because it was seen as an experience rather than a condition. A man was still a soldier, a worker, or a citizen temporarily displaced, and waiting was merely something he was doing, not something he had become. This distinction preserved a sense of self that existed beyond the camp. Even frustration, when it surfaced, carried a forward-facing quality. It was directed at delay, not at time itself. The men did not resent waiting as a concept, because they believed it had a conclusion. Complaints, when voiced internally, assumed an audience, whether guards, administrators, or fate itself, and this assumption kept the psychological structure intact. But beneath this surface stability, something subtle began to shift. Days accumulated without resolution, and the absence of clear progression introduced small inconsistencies into the narrative the men had built. The expected signs of transition failed to appear, and the timeline they carried internally grew less precise. Waiting still had an end in theory, but in practice, that end remained undefined. This was the moment when waiting stopped being a pause between actions and began to stretch outward, occupying more mental space than intended. The men did not yet recognize this change fully, because nothing dramatic marked its arrival. The routines continued, the structure remained, and life proceeded without visible collapse. Yet the quiet assumption that waiting would naturally resolve itself had begun to loosen, setting the stage for a deeper transformation that would not announce itself, but would steadily reshape how time, effort, and meaning were experienced inside the camp. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As waiting extended beyond what could be reasonably anticipated, time began to lose its forward direction. Days no longer felt like steps towards something else, but like repetitions of the same moment, unfolding with minor variations that failed to suggest progress. The prisoners still marked mornings and evenings, but these markers no longer implied movement toward an outcome. Instead, they simply confirmed that another cycle had completed without change. This shift altered how time was experienced internally. The future, once imagined as a destination waiting to be reached, became vague and increasingly irrelevant. Men found it harder to picture what would come next, not because they feared the future, but because the present consumed so much attention that imagining beyond it required effort. Time stopped feeling like a line and began to feel like a surface, wide and unmoving. Routine, which had once supported the idea of continuity, now reinforced stagnation. The same actions performed at the same hours no longer suggested order within a process, but repetition without trajectory. Meals arrived, roll calls continued, and work assignments remained unchanged. Yet none of these events signaled advancement. The system functioned perfectly while offering no sense of direction, and this contradiction slowly redefined how the prisoners related to time itself. Memory began to change under these conditions. Without meaningful variation between days, recollections blurred together, making it difficult to recall when a particular thought or feeling had first appeared. The past lost its clarity not because it was forgotten, but because it lacked distinction. Events that once would have stood apart merged into a continuous stretch, leaving fewer mental landmarks to organize experience. This loss of temporal structure affected motivation in subtle ways. Effort no longer felt connected to outcome because outcomes were no longer visible. Men continued to perform required tasks, but the internal reason for doing so shifted from preparation to maintenance. Actions were taken not to move forward, but to prevent deterioration, both physically and mentally. The goal was no longer progress, but preservation. Conversations reflected this change. References to the future grew rare, replaced by neutral observations about the present. Speculation faded, not because it had been disproven, but because it no longer felt useful. Silence increased, but it was not the silence of confusion or fear. It was the silence of attention turned inward, as each man adjusted to a version of time that did not invite expectation. Emotion adapted accordingly. Hope did not disappear, but it detached itself from specific timelines. Fear softened as well, because fear depends on imagining what might happen next, and imagining next had become difficult. What remained was a steady awareness of the present moment, stripped of anticipation and regret, focused on endurance rather than outcome. Importantly, this transformation did not feel dramatic or sudden. There was no moment when the men collectively realized that time had changed its character. The shift occurred gradually, through accumulation rather than impact, until one day it became noticeable that days were no longer counted with the same intent. Waiting was no longer about reaching an end, but about existing within a stretch of time that offered no indication of when or if it would conclude. By this stage, waiting had ceased to function as a bridge between moments. It had become the environment itself, shaping perception and behavior without needing to be acknowledged directly. Time no longer pointed forward, and without that direction, the prisoners began to adapt to a present that felt endless, preparing them for the deeper, psychological adjustments that would follow as waiting continued to redefine what it meant to live through time rather than move within it. As waiting settled into permanence, its influence extended beyond time and began to reshape how the prisoners understood themselves. Identity, which had once been anchored in past roles and future intentions, started to loosen, not through force, but through irrelevance. When days no longer pointed forward, the reasons that once defined who a person was began to feel distant, as if they belonged to another version of life that no longer applied. Men noticed this change quietly. They stopped thinking of themselves in terms of what they had been before captivity, not because those memories disappeared, but because they no longer provided guidance for the present. A former rank, profession, or personal ambition offered no advantage inside a system where waiting required no qualification. What mattered was not who someone had been, but how well they adapted to the stillness of each day. This shift altered how men related to one another. Early comparisons, where individuals measured themselves against others through strength, experience, or background, gradually faded. In their place emerged a more neutral awareness, where differences mattered less than shared endurance. Waiting reduced social distinctions by placing everyone inside the same temporal condition, where progress was unavailable and patience became the only common skill. Speech changed accordingly. Conversations grew shorter, not from fear, but from economy. Words that once helped define personality or express intention now felt unnecessary because they did not alter circumstances. Silence was no longer interpreted as withdrawal, but as alignment with a reality that required observation more than expression. Being present mattered more than being understood. Internally, attention shifted from narrative to sensation. Without a future to organize thoughts around, the mind focused on immediate experiences, such as physical comfort, fatigue, and the small variations that distinguished one day from another. This narrowing of focus was not a sign of intellectual decline, but a practical adjustment, allowing mental energy to be conserved in an environment that offered little external stimulation. Emotion followed the same pattern. Pride, frustration, and even hope became quieter because they depended on contrast and comparison, both of which had lost relevance. What remained was a muted steadiness, an emotional baseline that allowed survival without constant internal conflict. Feeling less became a way of managing more, reducing the strain that expectation and disappointment once created. The guards and camp structure reinforced this transformation without direct involvement. Their consistency treated everyone the same, regardless of background or past identity, confirming that personal distinctions no longer influence daily life. This reinforced the internal shift, encouraging prisoners to let go of identities that no longer served a function within the system. Over time, this change became self-sustaining, as men adapted to seeing themselves less as individuals moving through a story and more as participants in an ongoing condition. Resistance softened. Waiting was no longer something imposed upon them. It became something they inhabited. The sense of self adjusted accordingly, shrinking to fit the boundaries of the present moment. By this stage, waiting had accomplished more than delaying action. It had altered perception, flattened distinctions, and reshaped identity into something quieter and less defined by intention. The prisoners did not lose themselves entirely, but they learned to exist without the constant reinforcement of who they had been or who they hoped to become. In this new state, survival depended less on identity and more on adaptation, preparing them for the next shift where even the self would begin to feel less central than the condition of waiting itself. As waiting continued without interruption, the idea of control began to change its meaning. Early in captivity, control had been imagined as something external, exercised by schedules, rules, and authority, something that pressed in from the outside and could be measured by how tightly it constrained movement. Over time, however, it became clear that the most persistent form of control was not imposed through orders, but through the slow removal of situations that require decision. When nothing asked to be chosen, the habit of choosing weakened. The days offered fewer moments where initiative mattered. Tasks were assigned, movements were guided, and pauses were filled automatically by routine. This did not feel oppressive at first, because predictability reduced anxiety. Yet predictability also reduced agency, not by forbidding action, but by making action unnecessary. The men learned that whether they anticipated or hesitated made no difference to how the day unfolded, and this realization gradually dulled the impulse to assert preference. Inside this environment, choice became smaller and quieter. Decisions narrowed to matters of comfort and conservation, such as where to sit, how to pace breathing, or when to rest the eyes. Larger questions, once debated internally, faded into the background because they lacked consequences. When decisions do not lead anywhere, the mind learns to stop presenting them. In this way, waiting did not confront control directly, it bypassed it. This shift affected how responsibility was felt. Without meaningful choices, responsibility lost its edge because there was little to claim ownership over. Success and failure became difficult to define as outcomes no longer reflected effort or intention. The men continued to follow instructions, but following did not feel like obedience in the traditional sense. It felt more like alignment with a system that moved independently of individual will. Emotion adjusted to this change with a subtle relief. Letting go of control reduced the pressure to evaluate oneself constantly. Without decisions to judge, there are fewer opportunities for regret or self-criticism. This relief, however, came with a cost, because surrendering control also meant surrendering a sense of authorship over one's own experience. Life continued, but it no longer felt authored from within. Interactions among the prisoners reflected this adjustment. Advice was rarely offered, not because of indifference, but because advice assumes that choice matters. When outcomes were fixed by structure, guidance felt unnecessary. Each man navigated the day alone, not in isolation, but in parallel, sharing space without sharing responsibility for direction. The camp authorities remained consistent, reinforcing this pattern unintentionally. Their reliability removed uncertainty, but it also removed opportunities for negotiation. There was nothing to argue against and nothing to appeal to. Control, once imagined as something to resist, had become something diffuse, embedded in time and repetition rather than in visible enforcement. As weeks passed, the men noticed that the absence of control no longer caused frustration. Instead, it created a steady neutrality, a state where reacting strongly felt unwarranted. The desire to influence circumstances weakened, replaced by a practical acceptance of limits. Waiting had trained them to exist without exertion, to conserve energy by allowing events to proceed without internal interference. By this stage, control had not been taken away so much as it had dissolved. The men did not feel dominated in the traditional sense, nor did they feel free. They existed in a space where choice had been reduced to its smallest scale, and within that reduction, waiting continued to shape experience quietly. The loss was not dramatic, and it did not announce itself, but it marked a significant transformation, one where survival depended less on directing life and more on allowing it to pass without resistance, preparing the ground for the final adjustment that waiting would bring. By the fifth stage, Waiting no longer felt like something that was happening to them, but like the natural condition of life inside the camp. It no longer stood out as an experience that required interpretation or resistance, because it had absorbed every other aspect of the day. The men did not wake up thinking about waiting, nor did they go to sleep measuring how much of it had passed. Waiting had become so complete that it no longer needed attention, functioning quietly in the background of every moment. Daily routines continued unchanged, but they were no longer perceived as parts of a larger process. They existed on their own, disconnected from any sense of movement or purpose beyond completion. Tasks were done because they appeared, not because they led somewhere. Rest was taken because fatigue arrived, not because strength needed to be preserved for a future event. In this environment, action and rest lost their strategic meaning and became simple responses to immediate conditions. The mind adapted to this state by lowering its expectations. Thoughts no longer searched for patterns that suggested progress, because progress was no longer anticipated. Instead, attention settled into a narrow range, focused on maintaining balance rather than achieving outcomes. This narrowing did not feel like defeat, but like efficiency, allowing mental effort to be spent only where it was required for endurance. Emotion followed the same path. Strong reactions faded, not because feeling was suppressed, but because there was nothing for emotion to attach itself to. Without change, excitement and disappointment lost their relevance. What remained was a calm neutrality that made it possible to exist without constant adjustment. This emotional flattening was not chosen deliberately. It emerged naturally as waiting removed the triggers that once demanded response. Memory continued to blur under these conditions. Days were remembered as sequences of sensations rather than events, and recalling when something had begun or ended became increasingly difficult. Time was no longer experienced as a series of moments to be marked, but as a continuous presence that surrounded everything. This made the past feel distant and the future abstract, leaving the present as the only space that required attention. The men noticed that even the idea of an end had grown faint, not because they believed waiting would last forever, but because imagining its conclusion required a mental shift they no longer practiced. Waiting had trained them to exist without anticipating release, instruction, or resolution. The absence of expectation made survival easier, but it also made change harder to imagine. By this point, waiting was no longer a reaction to captivity, nor a strategy for coping with uncertainty. It had become the framework through which life was understood. The men did not think of themselves as waiting anymore. They simply existed within a state where time passed without asking anything of them beyond persistence. In this state, resistance was unnecessary, control was irrelevant, and meaning no longer needed to be defined. As waiting settled fully into normalcy, it completed its quiet transformation. What began as a temporary pause had become the default condition, shaping thought, emotion, and perception without drawing attention to itself. The men carried on, not because they expected something to happen, but because continuing had become the simplest response to a world where waiting no longer felt like an interruption, but like the way life now moved forward silently and without announcement. In the end, nothing marked the moment when waiting finished its work, because there was no clear boundary between what came before and what followed. The days continued in their familiar rhythm, and the men moved through them without expecting explanation or resolution. What had changed was not the camp, but the way time was carried inside them, lighter now, less demanding, no longer asking to be understood. Waiting had begun as a pause, something to be endured until movement returned, but it ended as a condition that required no effort to maintain. Without anticipation, the strain eased. Without expectation, disappointment lost its weight. Life did not improve, but became manageable in a quieter way, shaped by acceptance rather than resistance. When they later looked back, it was not the length of the waiting they remembered most, but how it had slowly reshaped their sense of self and time. The waiting did not break them suddenly, nor did it leave visible marks. Instead, it settled gently, altering how they lived moment to moment, until continuing no longer felt like an act of patience, but simply the way life moved forward, steady and unannounced. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.